Imagine you're playing Dark Souls, you're getting your ass kicked, and you say to yourself, hold on, I'll just pull out my assault rifle real quick. Believe it or not, From Software actually made a game in 2003 that is essentially just this, Shadow Tower Abyss. The beginning has you chopping up goblins with a sword, but by the end, you're shooting harpies with an AR-15. This game is absolutely wild, and if you've ever wanted to hear the words FromSoft and Rocket Launcher in the same sentence, you should probably watch this video. But you know, this game came out almost 20 years ago. If only I had some way of going back in time. Yeah! If you're wondering why you've never heard of this game, it's probably because it actually never released outside of Japan, and it's only thanks to a fan translation that I was able to play this at all. Back when the game originally released, H-Tech was in charge of localization and was almost finished with the translation of the game until Sony backed out last minute, saying the game would be too niche for Western audiences. Surely this is a mistake Sony would never make again when it came to FromSoft and publishing. However, I think it's important to understand the series that directly led up to this game, Kingsfield. In case you're unfamiliar, Kingsfield is a series of slow-paced, first-person dungeon crawlers released by FromSoft between 1994 and 2001. I've posted 2 videos on these games, but basically all you need to know is that Demon Souls, and by extension the Souls series, is the spiritual successor of Kingsfield, and the 2 series share a surprising amount of similarities with each other. After the first 3 Kingsfields, 1998 saw the release of Shadow Tower, a spin-off of Kingsfield that kept the same basic gameplay with a few twists. If you're wondering why I'm covering Shadow Tower Abyss instead of the original Shadow Tower, it's because I don't think the first game did enough to separate itself from Kingsfield, whereas this one does quite a bit. So this game is the sequel to the spin-off of the series of games that inspired Demon Souls. Or another way of putting it would be that this is the Bloodborne of Kingsfield. And while that is a joke, it's more true than you might think. Bloodborne is the spin-off of a series known for its medieval fantasy setting that kept the same core gameplay and camera perspective while introducing new mechanics, faster gameplay, guns, and a Lovecraftian setting. Literally all of this can be said about Shadow Tower Abyss as well. But with all of that out of the way, let's get into the game itself. To briefly go over the story, there's this ancient powerful spear that was once part of an old kingdom, and the power of this weapon has become some sort of legend. So you know, your standard MacGuffin type deal. Cut to our character, just some guy who I don't even think is named, as he walks through a forest led by a guide in search of, presumably, this magic spear. You find some ruins, they swallow you up, you start getting chased, bang bang, there goes the torch, oh shit, fade to black. And with that, we're in the game, but hold up, let's change the controls real quick, because despite being a first-person game released in 2003, 2 years after Halo, the default control scheme is not left stick to walk and right stick to look around. Luckily, if we scroll all the way over to Type 4, we can select it and enter the 21st century. From there, we are alone in the dark. There's actually a cool moment here where the game slowly brightens to emulate how your eyes would adjust to the dark. With my sight finally granted, I took 5 steps forward down some stairs before immediately being crushed by a stone statue that fell and sent me back to the main menu. Now I know a lot of people might understandably react to something like this by simply quitting the game, thinking that random insta-kill traps are not worth their time, but this is actually just a callback to Kingsfield and how all those games also start with a random death trap. On attempt number 2, I heroically strafed to the right and made it to the bottom of the stairs where I found a dying man who told me to quote, kill them all before slumping over and dying. In addition to the knife I looted off his body, I also had a pistol. With both of these weapons equipped, I heard a strange noise and followed a little goblin deeper into the forest. Here, the atmosphere is heavy and there's a sense of dread and darkness with only a bit of light shining down. I'd also like to point out how this first area with its tall grass, roots along the walls, and shafts of light peeking down is shockingly similar to the first area in Dark Souls 2. And fun fact, the director of Dark Souls 2, Yui Tanamura, worked on this game. Speaking of Dark Souls 2, maybe there was immense pressure on Tanamura to take the wheel after Miyazaki's direction led the company to an absolutely meteoric rise in fame. And maybe Miyazaki's absence combined with this pressure led the game to draw more from the company's past. And maybe it's no coincidence that the Black Sheep of the Souls series shares the most similarities with FromSoft's early games like Kingsfield and Shadow Tower. And maybe it would actually be an interesting video topic to explore Dark Souls 2 not only as a Souls game, but through the lens of the Kingsfield series to properly examine what actually happened with that game. Anyway, the first piece of armor you find is a bucket hat, and true to life, this bucket hat increases your stats. Just like the guns, having modern day items in the game juxtaposed against fantasy creatures and swords will always be funny. And although we don't get to see our character modeled in game wearing all of this, it's very fun to imagine him wearing this hat with plate armor, cargo shorts, and a shotgun. On the topic of equipment, let's talk about our stats real quick. Vitality, strength, and dexterity, yeah, you know, I can pretty much guess what these do. Concentration, mentality, and mind, Fucking uh-oh. And looking these up isn't really an option because there's no in-game stat explanation, there's no wiki, and there's not even a guide on game facts. However, the good news is that just like Kingsfield, if you equip the thing that makes the most numbers go up, you're probably fine. And while most of your stats come from gear, you do level up passively in the background as you kill monsters, as well as finding these soul pots occasionally that give you a few free stats. Now let's talk about the combat, because it's surprisingly the biggest selling point of the entire game. The big feature here is enemy dismemberment. You can chop or shoot off arms, legs, and heads. This alone is fun and satisfying, but this feature actually affects gameplay too. Chopping off the arms of an enemy that was holding a weapon will leave them alive, but with a much weaker offense. Shooting off the wing of a harpy will cause it to fall to the ground and attack you on foot. I really want to emphasize how impressed I was with the level of effort on display here to create all the different walking and attack animations that were necessary to make this work. FromSoft played with this mechanic in a lot of fun ways too. One memorable example was near the start with this monster with a giant club. I shot his head off thinking I got an easy kill, only for him to get back up seemingly more angry and more aggressive than before. Another example is how later in the game there are these enemies with parasites attached to their bodies, and you need to chop off the limb with the parasite or else the enemy will just keep regrowing its body parts. And just to throw it out there, this did all come out 5 years before Dead Space, which is the game I think most people think of first for this type of limb cutting mechanic. We're not done talking about combat yet though, because Shadow Tower also introduced what is sort of the first iteration of what would become the stamina based combat in Demon's Souls. The Kingsfield games all have this power bar for melee, which resembles a stamina bar, but not quite, because 1 bar equals 1 swing, and then you have to wait for it to come back. Shadow Tower has these yellow stamina circles that each represent a single swing, so finally we have a game where we can chain attacks together without needing to wait constantly. And while you still do have those moments of circle strafing, which is core to the Kingsfield experience, overall combat's a lot faster and more natural feeling than Kingsfield. Also, instead of just having a single attack type per weapon, there are 4 different swings this time. Left to right, right to left, top to bottom, and thrust attack. Every weapon gets access to all 4, so it's up to you as the player to notice which damage type is best. For example, you'd probably want to stick to slashes for an axe and thrusting attacks for a rapier, but what's cool is that you don't always have to. Maybe there's a moment where you want a bit of extra range with an axe, so you opt for a thrust, or maybe you see an opportunity to slash off an arm with a rapier. I think you can trace this sort of on-the-fly decision making on what attack type to use directly to the Souls series. In summary though, there are a lot of neat ideas on display here. Back to our playthrough, we enter the forest, kill some goblins, find a sword, drop down a hole, and make our way over to a boat. This boat ride on the water is where we really cross the threshold from the somewhat familiar to the unknown, and it's a nice little sequence. As we continue, things get very alien very quickly. Check out these little guys. This is also where we run into a demon scythe lady, who is one of the only human-like characters we interact with for the entire game. She calls us Hunted One, which is neat given the Bloodborne parallels mentioned earlier and how we're the hunter in that game instead. She's also sort of an early example of what would later turn into the classic FromSoft trope of having a mysterious woman near the hub be a central character. She gives us a key, and with that, we finally get to enter the Shadow Tower. From here, the goal for the rest of the game is to work our way to the top of this tower through a series of elevators locked by keys we need to find. Now that we're finally in the tower, I want to talk a bit about the exploration and progression in this game. There are separate zones and biomes that are connected to each other, but in a fairly linear way. When you finish one, you're probably not going back. The world isn't interconnected in the same way that Kingsfield was, and backtracking is almost non-existent. I found the level structures within each zone disappointingly linear as well. A few zones do have cool ideas, and most play with verticality in interesting ways, but for the most part, it's a little too easy to figure out where to go. Getting lost with branching paths is mostly absent, so overall it feels like a step back from Kingsfield. All that being said, I think combat was intended to be more heavily emphasized this time around, so having exploration be less of a focus does kind of fit. Speaking of design, I appreciate how most of the creatures felt like they belonged in this world compared to the feeling of randomness at times in Kingsfield. Giant plants in a jail cell and skeletons walking underwater definitely have their charm, but environments that better match the designs of their inhabitants feel like a step up. Let's look at the first area of the tower, the insect zone. Not only is the environment well suited for the giant bugs walking around, but there are little moments that make it all feel alive. I watched as a bug worked away on a wall. I saw 2 bugs carry the corpse of another away, and I remember 2 different factions of insects fighting each other as I stood to the side and watched. These are small things, but they went a long way in helping the world feel more believable and organic. I also want to talk about how scarce resources are. Bullets are extremely limited, so you'll mostly have to rely on melee, but even that has its own challenges with weapons being incredibly brittle. Some of these swords and daggers will have a durability of like 7, and what that means is that a weapon can break after only a couple encounters. As a result, I found myself cycling through a variety of weapons and not just using the strongest thing I had on hand at the time. There was this tension with the scarcity of resources here, so it's a shame that this mostly goes away in later parts of the game when you have a lot more items and money. On the topic of resources, let's also go over the game's economy real quick. There are 3 different shops, which are just the these glowing orbs that you'll find throughout each level. One is for buying and selling items, another is for converting old weapons into HP, and the last is for converting HP into durability for damaged weapons. I found the dynamic between these three to be interesting early on, but in the late game, I pretty much just used the one for buying and selling. Moving on, it wouldn't be a FromSoft game without a poison area, so it's a good thing that this next zone is literally named Poison Area. As the name might imply, this area poisons you, and it does that by having poison gas in basically every room. Luckily, you can find these crystals that you can insert into pedestals to cleanse the gas, but the reality is that you'll be poisoned constantly as you walk around, so hopefully you've stocked up on potions. I also love how big and grotesque the creatures that wander around here are. If you chop off their tails, a couple little monsters shoot out, so depending on what you cut off, the dismemberment mechanic can occasionally make things harder. But yeah, it really is fascinating how obsessed FromSoft seems to be with poison gas and poison swamps. The next area is this gray cavern with loads of one-eyed monsters that hop around. Surprisingly, some of them are non-hostile and will talk to you. Long ago, God was here. Now, no longer. Here, take this potion. Another cool thing is how you can periodically hear a big roar in the background, and all the enemies will react and cower in fear for a few seconds. Speaking of which, this game has no music. The soundscape is usually just your own footsteps coupled with creepy noises like this now and then. At the end of the cavern, we find the source of the roaring, a big cat thing, and our first straight up boss fight. So the trick to this guy is you want to stand back, pull out your gun, and hit the shoot button a few times. And this is actually true for the entire game with the rest of the bosses. Our guns do a lot of damage, so most fights are over in seconds. On one hand, this is silly, it's barely gameplay, but on the other hand, it feels appropriate. Guns are devastatingly powerful and would rightfully trivialize most fights if inserted into a fantasy setting. Understandably, most games never lean into this for balance reasons, so it's kind of interesting to see one that does. So before anyone comments it, yes, this is Bloodborne if guns actually did damage. Anyway, with the boss dead, our reward is an elevator key to the next floor. As I progressed through the tower, things got more and more alien. The next area has pulsating tentacles bursting through walls and bisecting rooms and hallways. This is also where I encountered the parasite enemies. They provide a fun little twist on enemies you've already fought by forcing you to focus on different body parts than when you fought their non-parasite versions earlier. Alongside these guys, I ran into big tentacle monsters that fired lasers. While not quite the same, these enemies reminded me a lot of the giant worms in the Stonefang tunnels from Demon's Souls, so I wouldn't be shocked if inspiration on those designs was taken from this game. But even more interesting than tentacles is how Patches makes an appearance. Yes, the Patches. Well, maybe not literally him, since this guy has hair and a beard, but he does the whole routine. He tricks you into entering a room with the promise of treasure, but all you find is a giant explosion trap instead. Then he runs off to the next area. When you find him again, he apologizes and asks you to forgive him by offering you a map before immediately pulling a lever and dropping the bridge out from under you. It's really funny how this is almost exactly what we see in the Souls games, and I'm genuinely so surprised I've never heard anyone mention how the Patches running gag goes all the way back to this game. After getting dropped in the water, I was officially in the waterfall zone. We got fish, dinosaurs, and a life jacket that likes to break the rules. One of the main hazards in this area are these underwater chasms with currents that try to pull you in. The scariest moment of the entire game is right here, where you drop down into the water and instantly start getting pulled in, so you gotta react immediately to survive. This is also the area where I made the horrifying discovery of how item encumbrance is handled in this game. Basically, there's no equipment burden, but there is item burden, and the total weight of everything in your inventory does matter. If you go a little over the weight limit, your character just moves a bit slower. No worries, this makes sense, but here's where it gets weird. If you go even further beyond the weight limit, suddenly you start moving much slower, and on top of that, you start taking constant damage, with the implication that your character is slowly being crushed to death by everything you're carrying. Here's the best part though, dropping items is not a thing. As crazy as it sounds, you can only get rid of items via the occasional shop by selling or storing them there. And that brings us to the hilarious sequence of me realizing all of this in the water level, underwater, with no shop in sight. I had to backtrack to the last area, slowly crawling up the stairs as my character refused to drop even a single pair of shoes while getting crushed to death. I don't know why FromSoft made the game like this, and it's kind of terrible, but the whole thing was so funny to me that I don't even care. Next, we got the cliff zone, which has harpies and plenty of places to fall off. This area is especially linear, with you mostly following a series of walkways, but it's just so satisfying shooting these guys and watching their wings or heads fly off. This is also around the point in the game where I feel like the game shifts from a mix of melee and guns to mostly just guns. And it got me thinking about how seamless the transition from melee-based dungeon crawler to first-person shooter was. It's neat that this just happens in the background as a result of accumulating more resources while also being presented with more flying enemies that encourage range attacks. I really like the idea of a game switching genres as you progress. After that, I arrived in the sand level. This one was pretty fun because I got to use a shotgun for most of it, and as we all know, using shotguns in video games is universally fun. At the end, I found what I think is supposed to be the spear from the beginning intro cutscene, but it just breaks and crumbled away. Then a monster burrowed out of the ground and said he wanted me to show him my power. Apparently that power is a few bullets to the face. Then the game continues without any real explanation of why the spear just broke and what you should be searching for now. From here, there are 3 zones left, so I'll give you the highlights. The enemies in this fog area are neat because they're invisible, so you need to watch where they shoot from to figure out where they are. This area has straight up robots that you need to shoot while standing on moving platforms, and this area is sort of your standard castle setting, which has you wandering through hallways, walking through portals, and shooting knights. So like I mentioned a minute ago, the game had basically fully transitioned into a first-person shooter at this point. I had so much extra money and I was able to buy plenty of guns and ammo, including a sniper rifle and a rocket launcher. In addition to the absurdity of gunning down a knight with a mini Uzi, I found it really amusing how the game kept dumping all this treasure on me that no longer mattered whatsoever. Like sure, flaming axes and lightning Zweihanders are great, but to repeat myself, I had a rocket launcher. There's even this entire zone whose main purpose seems to be serving as a treasure area. It literally has a dozen rooms, each filled with multiple chests with loot inside. I needed none of this and was left with a feeling of confusion in the face of the sheer volume of treasure here. Well, it's fun to imagine that this feeling is purposeful and intended as some form of subtextual parody on how getting too strong or rich can be boring. I think the more likely explanation is that they ran out of time to implement more areas that were planned and opted to throw in all the extra items somewhere. Before we get to the end, I want to throw in a few other things I noticed but haven't mentioned yet. First is that apparently I found a pendant at some point. I genuinely don't remember where I got this and I definitely didn't use it anywhere, but I think this might be what Miyazaki was referencing in Dark Souls 1 with the pendant starting item. It even has the same description about being useless. Given how much the Souls community theorized about this item, I think it's really cool that this appeared in an earlier game. Second, enemies respawn weirdly fast sometimes. For example, here I killed this guy, walked 10 feet away to pick up a sword, then immediately came back and he was already alive again. This is pretty unsatisfying, so I wish this wasn't a thing. Third, you can actually cast spells. I just never mentioned it because it was very underwhelming. Instead of permanently learning a spell like in Kingsfield, you equip rings that you can find to cast spells. Then, in addition to costing MP to use, these rings quickly decrease in durability while having generally low damage. The end result is a system that doesn't seem worth it when you could just shoot an enemy instead. Lastly, this game has over 500 pieces of gear to find between weapons and armor. Granted, a lot of them are just recolors or reskins, but it's still kind of impressive and weirdly ambitious for a game that'll take most people between 6 and 8 hours to beat. This is related to why I think there was originally more planned in terms of areas to explore. With that out of the way, it's time for the ending. I eventually reached the top of the tower by going up all the elevators and I found a giant pulsating heart that could talk. It had a couple lines about conflict and being cursed, and then suddenly the scythe lady from the start showed up to defend it. However, this fight was over in about 15 seconds thanks to the rocket launcher. With her gone, the shield around the heart dissipated and I fired one last shot to destroy it. The heart says one final cheesy line about how we both just wanted to live with all our hearts. Cut to black. Our guy wakes up outside of the ruins, gets up, and takes one final look back. Then he turns around to walk off into the woods, but wait, what's this? The scythe lady is still alive and hiding behind a tree. We then get a close-up of her eye, which flashes to the same eye from the spear in the intro. And that's it. Roll credits, I guess. So yeah, that's Shadow Tower Abyss. As weird and niche as it is, it's still insane to me that this never got officially localized. This easily could have become a cult hit at release. And while I still think I prefer Kingsfield due to the greater focus on exploration, this is probably a better entry point if you've ever been curious about dipping your toes into FromSoft's past of janky first-person dungeon crawlers. The dismemberment mechanic combined with the juxtaposition of modern day and fantasy is so novel and entertaining that I'm willing to overlook quite a few rough edges. And if there's one game that could massively benefit from a remake without losing what made it special, it's this one. Anyway, I think that does it. Thanks for watching. This video is sponsored by Skillshare, but this isn't your average sponsored plug because I have a special guest, Andre the Blacksmith.
I'm Andre of Astora.
Skillshare is an online learning community for creatives where you can learn a variety of skills, like, for example, video editing. And to prove how easy Skillshare can make the process of learning, I signed up Andre here for a class on Premiere Pro. You ready, buddy?
I can hardly wait to get started.
Hell yeah, let's do it. Alright man, let's see what you made. Nice. But yeah, the first 1,000 people who use the link in the description will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare, so check it out, be creative, and make cool things. Thanks again for the help, Andre.
Andre of Astora gets the job done.